transportation, and equitable solutions. Before we begin, all of us at the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health respectfully acknowledge that our advocacy, education, and learning across the country takes place on the occupied and unceded lands of many Native American tribes. To acknowledge this land is to recognize its long history and our place in that history. It is to recognize these lands and waters and their significance for the peoples who lived and continue to live in this country, and whose practices and spiritualities were, are, and shall always be tied to the land and the water. Today's webinar is the sixth in our 2023 Climate Justice webinar series as part of the Climate and Health Equity Fellowship Program. Known as the CHEF program, this fellowship recognizes the need for more diversity in climate and health leadership and a sharper focus on equitable climate solutions. The goal of the fellowship is to empower doctors of color from populations that face greater burdens from climate effects and are underrepresented in medicine to become leaders in climate and health equity, education, advocacy, and policy solutions. I'm Dr. Shanita Johnson, Climate and Health Equity Fellowship Director. Also joining me from the consortium to run this webinar is Program Assistant Clarissa Payton. Clarissa will be available through the chat to answer any technical questions during our webinar. Other team members on the webinar are Dr. Kimberly Williams, Program Manager, Dr. Venice Curry, the Western Associate Director, and Jordan Curry-Carter, Program Manager. The webinar series is hosted by the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health. It is held for 1 hour on the second Friday of each month from 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Today's webinar will be recorded and made available on our website for future viewing as part of the Equity Resources page on the consortium's website. This year, we are pleased to offer CME credit for our webinars. Instructions on obtaining the CME credit will be provided at the end of the webinar. We are honored today to have Dr. Maria Cecilia Pinto deMoura, Senior Vehicles Engineer in the Clean Transportation Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Rather than using our time to provide further description of her impressive work, we are placing a link to her bio in the chat that can be accessed for reference. As a healthcare provider, it is important that you consider the role that healthcare systems and providers play in regard to climate and health. In this webinar, Dr. Pinto deMoura will discuss current topics from the intersection of climate change, transportation emissions, health impacts, and equity. The general format for today's webinar will be one 35 to 40-minute presentation, followed by 10 to 15 minutes of questions and answers from our audience. We ask that you kindly put comments, links to any resources that you may recommend, or any questions that you may have for the presenter in the chat box at any time during this presentation. We will attempt to get to as many of these questions as we can during the Q&A period. Please also keep yourself muted so we are not interrupted by background noise. Dr. Pinto deMoura, thank you for joining us, and you may begin.
Hello, welcome everybody, and thank you very much for having me the third consecutive year. And as was described, today I'm going to be talking about the intersection of health, clean transportation, and equitable solutions. So, the world is facing three major crises: the global warming crisis, local pollution, and racial and socioeconomic inequity. We experience consequences from these three crises every single day, a bit differently, depending what country we live in, what community we live in, and who we are as individuals. For some, it could be the hottest summer day on record. For another, it could be an impending flood that could wash away your home, or invisible harms, such as the particulate matter that enters and stays in your lungs, and could even be in the brain of your newborn baby. The bad news is that politicians who have the tools to implement solutions and industry leaders who often oppose mitigation policies are not listening close enough, and time is running out. The good news is that there is a large amount of science backing the origin of these crises. And the sources of greenhouse gas pollutions and local pollution, the technically and economically feasible pathways to a sustainable future. And there's also, we've also discussed at length the history of the origins and the continued reality of racial and social economic inequity. So I want to start with a quote. In July, the UN chief Antonio Guterres issued a stark warning on climate change during a news briefing. He said, "The era of global warming has ended. The era of global boiling has arrived." And scientists have confirmed that there have been several extreme heat records broken this summer. Today, I want to look at some of the science behind these crises, and at the end, I'll summarize some of the solutions. So I'm going to go straight to the core of the problem. Fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas are the largest source of human-caused global warming emissions in the world. The fossil fuel industry and the consumption of its products accounted for a staggering 91% of global warming emissions from industry in 2015. In other words, if you take all of the industry emissions, the fossil fuel industry is responsible for 91%, the vast majority. And if you look at all global warming emissions, including non-industry, then the fossil fuel industry is still accountable for 70%, which is a lot. So first, I'd like to look at the intersection of these crises. The first one I'll look at is the global warming and local pollution intersection. So global warming is making it harder to protect human health. Right? That's a key point. So let's go back in time to 1997. The targets for the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol cover emissions of the 6 main greenhouse gases that are shown in orange here in that box on the left. Right? They are the same 6 greenhouse gases that are covered by the US greenhouse gas inventory. The primary greenhouse gases are CO2, carbon dioxide, and CH4, methane, meaning that they are responsible for most of the heat trapping from the greenhouse effect. But there are 3 other greenhouse gases that are important: water vapor, stratospheric ozone, and carbon monoxide. These are not often talked about. I'll talk about those in a few minutes. Right. The other greenhouse gases are the other substances that affect, that cause global warming are the ozone depleting substances, but stratospheric ozone, not ground level ozone. Right? And these substances are controlled by the 1987 Montreal Protocol and include halocarbons and chlorine and bromine containing substances. Then there are the fluorinated gases, right, that are all synthetic and really, really powerful greenhouse gases that are emitted from a variety of household, commercial, industrial applications. And they are sulfur hexafluoride, hydrofluorocarbons, and perfluorocarbons. So these names get thrown around a lot. So it's nice to see them all together and understand their roles. So what I want to stress here is that why am I going through all these, this basic knowledge? So what I want to do is stress that there are several facts that are not often mentioned that amplify the harms caused by global and local pollutants. Okay, so on the right, we have a box with the local air pollution substances. The criteria air pollutants, there are 6 of them. The hazardous air pollutants and hydrogen sulfide. So I'm going to give some examples. So number 1, greenhouse gases often lead, the emissions of greenhouse gases often leads to the co-emissions of local air pollutants. For example, when you burn gasoline in your car, you're producing carbon dioxide, particulate matter, PM2.5, NOx, and carbon monoxide. When you burn diesel, you get a lot of volatile organic compounds, very toxic as well. So mitigation policies for greenhouse gases will mitigate local air pollution at the same time. One example of this is the current EPA rulemaking for multi-pollutant standards for light-duty vehicles that will address greenhouse gases as well as local pollutants. The second example of this nexus between local pollutants and global warming is that some local pollutants actually amplify global warming. So it's worse than you think. I don't want to be negative, but one example is how carbon monoxide is normally to be a local pollutant emitted from burning fossil fuels, is also an important indirect greenhouse gases. So there are models that show that the emissions, say, of 100 megatons of carbon monoxide causes all these perturbations in atmospheric chemistry that ends up being equivalent to a certain amount of methane. In this case, if you emit 100 megatons of carbon monoxide, it's equivalent to about 5 megatons of methane. So 3, there are feedback mechanisms that also amplify global warming. For instance, the emission of methane perturbs its own chemistry. It affects its lifetime, and it amplifies methane's heat trapping capability. Another example, water vapor. Water vapor is the strongest greenhouse gas. That's why it's up first in that box on the left. But its human direct contribution is small. This is all natural. However, as the atmosphere warms due to global warming, the concentration of water vapor increases, intensifying the greenhouse effect in a self-reinforcing cycle. So this water vapor feedback may be so strong enough to approximately double the increase in the greenhouse effect due to adding CO2 alone. And the fourth example of the intersection between global warming and local pollutants I want to give you is one that affects us every day, especially in the summer. Global warming leads to increase in ground level ozone because its abundance is controlled primarily by emissions of methane, carbon monoxide, NOx, volatile organic compounds, all substances released by the combustion of fossil fuels in cars in the presence of sunlight. So currently the ground level ozone, also which is tropospheric, which means low down in the atmosphere, as opposed to the stratospheric ozone, should not be confused with, so this ground level ozone is the third most important greenhouse gas after CO2 and methane. And so this particular increase in ground level ozone due to all the other emissions has direct implications for human health. Okay, so let's move on. Now I want to look at the global warming and inequity nexus. Now, there is a lot of work done on this topic, so I'm not going to dwell on it, but that doesn't mean it's not important. It is extremely important. So climate change aggravates inequality, right? Why? Because some groups have greater exposure and greater susceptibility to climate hazards, and they have less ability to cope and recover for many reasons. There's a disproportionate loss of assets and income in many groups. long-standing gender, racial, and economic inequalities mean that historically marginalized communities are usually the most affected and the hardest hit and the most impacted. And people in low and lower middle income countries, now we're moving to the global perspective, are people in these countries are around 5 times more likely than people in high income countries to be displaced by sudden extreme weather disasters. Now, there's much more work on this. I just wanted to touch on this because that's an extremely important point of intersection. Now, the third intersection point, which is global warming, we looked at global warming and local pollutants. We looked at global warming and inequity. The one that's missing that we have to look at is local pollution and inequity. That is most of what I'm going to be talking about. So let's move to that one. Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot about this. The one study that we did at UCS about extreme heat, I recommend that you take a look at it. It shows that of course, extreme heat is one of the deadliest weather hazards that society faces. And it looks at the heat index around the country and for the next few decades, and shows what we think will probably happen. And so basically during extremely hot days, heat-related deaths spike and hospital admissions for heat-related illnesses rise, especially among people experiencing poverty, elderly adults, and other vulnerable groups. So I have a picture of the cover of our report on the left, and then there was a journal published article as well, which I have a little screenshot down at the bottom. Increased frequency and population exposure to extreme heat index in the US during the 21st century. So now moving on. I'm sure you all know this, but just a review. Global warming potentials are terms that are also thrown around and are often confusing. So global warming potentials are measures of relative radiative, meaning heat, radiative effect of a given substance, such as, say, methane, compared to another, say, carbon dioxide, integrated over a chosen time horizon. Now, that last sentence is extremely important, that integration over a chosen time horizon. So methane is 84 to 87 times as potent as a heat-trapping gas over the next 20 years. But because it has a very small lifetime, from 7 to 12 years, if you integrate it over 100 years, and meaning look at the impact over 100 years, that potency goes down to 28 to 36 times the potency of CO2, still much more. Nitrous oxide, notice that it's not nitrogen oxide. Nitrous oxide has a global warming potential that's 273 over 100 years. And then the high global warming potential gases, right, the ones that I showed, the hydrofluorocarbons, etc., have global warming potentials that are thousands or tens of thousands of times as potent as CO2. And here's an interesting bit of information. If we look at the temperature rise of the planet, the average temperature, global temperature rise to date, right, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, carbon dioxide is approximately responsible for 70% of that temperature rise, which is, I think, 1.1 degrees centigrade, so up till now. And methane and the other high potency gases are responsible for 30%. In other words, what the point I'm making here is CO2 and methane are the big culprits here. And they originate mainly from fossil fuel production and consumption. So even though it's not the most potent global warming gas compared to methane and the other gases, CO2, which is the gas that we most talk about, can stay in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. It's a very stable molecule. And so it has a really long-term cumulative impact on climate. So CO2 concentration in the atmosphere has increased by 50% since the Industrial Revolution, and it continues to skyrocket. Right? Methane, on the other hand, which has been responsible for the remainder of the temperature, the 30%, has increased even more, 150% since the Industrial Revolution. But as I said, it has a shorter lifetime. And so, because it is a far more potent global warming gas, it's extremely important. And we have to remember that natural gas, the composition of the natural gas that we use in power plants and in many homes varies, but typically about 85% of this produced gas is composed of methane, right? And so I wanted to show you the inventory of greenhouse gas from the EPA. It's like almost 80% of that is of the greenhouse gases in the entire economy are CO2, and 11.5 are methane, and that's already accounting the potency has already been taken care of there. So in other words, the vast amount of CO2 is that's why we have to focus on both CO2 and methane, but mostly on CO2. By the way, it says here that in this inventory that methane is 11.5% of the share of all greenhouse gases. But the truth is that this share is estimated and is likely to be considerably underreported, mostly because of flaring and venting in the oil and gas industry. I'll show that. We'll go into that in a minute. So, summarizing, fossil fuels are the largest source of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions in the world. And as I showed, they are the primary drivers of the climate crisis. Right? I already mentioned that 91% of industrial greenhouse gases are from the fossil fuel industry, and 70% are of all greenhouse gases are from the fossil fuel industry. That's in 2015, but it shouldn't have changed that much. Now, here's another bit of like extremely shocking, I thought, the first time I read this. Since 1988, more than half of the global industrial emissions in greenhouse gases can be traced to just 25 corporate or state-owned entities which are actively producing fossil fuels. Just 25 entities since 1988, more than half. And simultaneously, the local pollutants, I mean, we've been talking about greenhouse gases a lot, but remember that there is a direct link there, right? Every time you emit a greenhouse gas, you're likely emitting a local pollutant or many as well, right? So the local pollutants from the oil and gas industry are a major contribution to public health and racial inequity crisis. And I got this research on the 25 corporate entities producing fossil fuel comes from an interesting report by from 2017 called the Carbon Majors Report. Oh, by the way, I did not finish listing all my references for you. So I put the references in the slides, but I do not have a slide at the end with the links and the full names of the studies. So I will owe you that. So now let's move on to looking at greenhouse gas emissions by sector. So if you look on the left, right, you see transportation is responsible for 29%, industry for 30%, commercial and residential for 30%, and agriculture for 11%. This is all greenhouse gases in the economy, right? Now, if you separate out the electricity sector, then these proportions change. Right? On the left, you have the use of electricity within each sector, and on the right, the electricity sector has been removed. So the reason I put this graph here is that people often ask me to reconcile these different statistics, like, oh, transportation is 29% here and 28% there, and what's going on? So I find the one on the right more useful because it shows the actual contributions of each sector, right? And so we know that if electric power becomes more decarbonized, that purple wedge there will shrink, right? And we'll know exactly what's going on. Let's see. By the way, these percentages are going to change, right? Because as we get closer to 2050, the transportation share of responsibility will actually increase relative to the total economy. And the reason is that the relative share of the power sector is going to decrease fast, because decarbonizing the power sector is easier in the near term, right? With the phasing out of coal and the increase in solar and wind. So decarbonized transportation is slower. It's happening, but it's a slower process than the decarbonizing the grid. And it depends mainly on the rate of electrification of vehicles. So here is a chart of the evolution of total US transportation energy in the last 70 years. Main message here: petroleum has been the primary energy source for over half a century in the US. Right? In this period, petroleum accounted for 80 up to 97% of all transportation energy. Not just that, the transportation use tripled between 1950 and 2005, which was the peak. And so since then, since 2005, the energy use in this sector has been roughly constant because of improved vehicle efficiency. And at the very, close to 2020, you see that biofuels have come in a little bit, and they're about 5% of transportation energy today. That includes ethanol. So why is this? Well, the US transportation sector is the least diversified of all end-use sectors. Think of the electricity sector with all its different forms of energy. So my main point here is that today, when we talk about transportation emissions, we are talking about fossil fuels, mainly oil and gas. So just a little bit more on the power sector. So in 2021, the US electricity mix was about 60% fossil-based and only 20% renewable. But with electrification and improved energy efficiency, we did a study at UCS showing that the share of electricity out of the total US energy demand triples from about 20 to about 60% at mid-century. So we need to decarbonize our grid because our electricity demand is going to triple. And the analysis we did, which I talked about in our last seminar, shows that wind and solar can provide about 60% of our electricity by 2030 and all the way up to 90% by 2050, mostly solar and wind. And here's another, I like to put these key facts because these are things that I really want people to be aware of, and are in this case, this is a fact that is often there's disinformation in the media. So an average electric vehicle, passenger electric vehicle, emits less than the average new gasoline car, even when emissions from electricity generation are considered, even a dirty grid, like in West Virginia. And this is anywhere in the US. And so this is often cited, oh, electric vehicles are fine, but they're dirtier because our electricity grid is dirty. Not true. And you can go to my colleague Dave Reichmuth's report, Driving Cleaner, to look for the numbers. Okay, so I already showed this chart. This is a previous chart showing how transportation greenhouse gases are 27% of the total greenhouse gas. Now we can see what kinds of vehicles are responsible for this, right? 57% of the transportation emissions come from passenger cars and light trucks. Another 26% from trucks and buses, and only 8% from aircraft. And the rest is rail, ships, and boats, and other vehicles. So this is important. Cars and light trucks they account for the largest share of greenhouse gases in transportation, and consequently, all the local pollutants that harm our health that go with that are co-emitted. And there is a frightening fact here. At least I'm frightened by it. So this is a graph of the change in global. Now we're talking global, not US. CO2 emissions in the entire energy sector in an 8-year period, and it shows the impact of the growing size of passenger cars. So if you look on the left, the power sector has been responsible for the biggest change, right? There's lots of coal and natural gas, and in spite of the growth of wind and solar. So the power sector has the biggest responsibility. However, next come SUVs, ahead of heavy industry, trucks, aviation, shipping, and all other internal combustion engines. So SUVs are according, this is important. It's according to this data is from the International Energy Agency. So today, almost half of all cars sold in the US and 1/3 of the cars that are sold in Europe are SUVs. And SUVs are responsible for 3.3 million barrels a day of growth in oil demand in these eight years, while all use from other types of cars has actually declined a little bit. So the conclusion here is that if our appetite for SUVs continues to grow at a similar pace seen in the last decade, the SUVs would add nearly 2 million barrels a day in global oil demand by 2040, offsetting the savings from nearly 150 million electric cars. I find that frightening. So let's keep going. So now let's talk about air pollutants. So I already covered this in my last talks, but let's just do an overview. So particulate matter, PM 2.5, which are smaller than 2.5 microns, smaller than 1/30th the diameter of a human hair, come mostly from vehicle tailpipes, industry, and from natural causes as well, like fires. So PM 2.5 causes the vast majority of global public health impacts. And according to one study, 8 million deaths around the world in 2018. And one of the problems is that it's dangerously small. It can cross the blood-brain barrier, for instance. Then we have nitrogen oxides, mostly NO2. So more than half of NOx is emitted by diesel vehicles and diesel equipment. And they contribute to the formation of ground-level ozone in one of those interactions between local pollutants. And so when they interact so they form additional PM 2.5 as well. And what's interesting about PM 2.5 is that the emitted share of PM 2.5 is actually fairly small compared to this additional creation in the atmosphere. I don't remember the exact number. Perhaps 70% is what's called secondary or additional. It's a lot. In other words, these interactions that happen in the atmosphere are super important. So nitrogen oxides cause lung irritation and weaken the body's immunity against lung diseases. Then there's sulfur oxides emitted by power plants and diesel vehicles. And they react in the atmosphere, again, to form more additional PM 2.5. And the health risks is, to asthmatics and particularly young children. Then there's carbon monoxide, and high concentrations can occur like right next to roads with heavy traffic, and it reduces the transport of oxygen in the body. Then there are hazardous air pollutants. Last time I didn't talk about these. I only talked about volatile organic compounds. So this time I thought I'd let you probably know this, but volatile organic compounds are a subset of hazardous air pollutants. So hazardous air pollutants are known or suspected to cause cancer or other serious health effects, such as reproductive health, birth defects, and other adverse environmental effects. And the EPA currently has a list of 188 of these toxic air pollutants. So the volatile organic compounds are a subset, and the reason they're classified separately, is that they have high vapor pressures and low water solubility. So they're more volatile. And they are very often components of petroleum-based fuels, especially diesel. And again, they react with NOx to produce ground-level ozone, and some are highly carcinogenic, like benzene. So I covered this last year. I tried to update it a little bit, but PM 2.5 is linked to many adverse health impacts, and it has been extensively studied, like really, really studied. There are hundreds of studies out there on various risks, health risks. So this is just a very small selection. So, for instance, the increased risk of death from cardiovascular diseases, decline in lung function, risk of COPDs, increased risk of death from lung cancer, slowed lung function and development of asthma in children, increased risk of low birth weight and infant mortality, childhood obesity, a link between prenatal exposure and autism, damage to nervous systems and the brain, including stroke, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's, psychiatric disorders, depression, anxiety, type 2 diabetes, increased risk of death from COVID-19. I mentioned this last time. An increase of just 1 milligram per cubic meter in PM 2.5 is associated with an 8% increase in COVID-19, the death from COVID-19. This was done by Harvard P. Chan School of Public Health back at the time of the pandemic. Now, here's one that has really amazed me. PM 2.5 is one of those toxic substances that are never cease to amaze me. So this study showed the effect of PM 2.5 on antibiotic resistance. Can you believe it? And I'm quoting from the article. Significant correlations between PM 2.5 and antibiotic resistance were consistent globally, right? In most antibiotic resistant bacteria. The 5 milligram per cubic meter target from the World Health Organization, if reached in 2050, right, would reduce antibiotic resistance by almost 17% and avoid 23% of premature deaths attributable to antibiotic resistance. Yeah, it's serious. Okay, let's go look at the oil and gas supply chain. And the reason I'm doing this is that it helps to look at the source of the various pollutants. So that diagram on the left shows up on top hazardous air pollutants, criteria air pollutants, and greenhouse gases, and how they come from each of the pieces of the supply chain of the oil and gas industry, right? So often the extraction part is just called upstream, right? And it includes more than extraction. It includes, drilling the wells. It includes development of the wells. And it's applicable for crude oil and natural gas and for coal. And what's called midstream, which is processing and transport, include all the oil refineries and the processing of natural gas and all the transportation that happens from the wells to the refineries and to the distribution. And then at the end, there's the combustion. In other words, it's the end use, right? Whether it's by the grid, by petrochemical facilities, by transportation, by industry, building heat for buildings, waste incineration, all those things are the combustion part, and they are by far the lion's share of emissions from the oil and gas supply chain. Now, I want to point you to an excellent literature review paper by Tim Donaghy from Greenpeace. It's a very current paper from this year. It's called Fossil Fuel Racism in the U.S., How Phasing Out Coal, Oil, and Gas Can Protect Communities. I highly recommend you take a look at it. I try to summarize some of the information in some slides that are to come, but it's really very, very rich in references. He has another earlier paper that I also recommend you look at that looks at environmental justice across industrial sectors. This earlier paper from 2021 uses data from the EPA's toxics release inventory and on toxic air and water emissions from a large number of industrial facilities and locations around the US. So while all the phases of production of petroleum-based products are very different, there's a broad range of operations and equipment. They all result in some kind of air, water, or soil contamination. There's no escape, even with controls. So let's look at some health impacts from the upstream emissions. That means from extraction. So non-conventional extraction. Well, the US has increased its production of non-conventional crude oils. And for instance, hydraulic fracturing, often also known as fracking, is one of these. And so there are also drilling techniques that go, parallel to the ground, and all kinds of high energy intensive extraction methods. These cause a lot of public health impacts. For instance, the risk of childhood acute lymphoblastic leukemia in Pennsylvania. There's one on fracking and infant health in Pennsylvania. Then there's another on the drilling and production as the main sources of NOx emissions. Then one that I'm very interested in, one topic, is the proximity to oil and gas wells, because of its repercussions for environmental justice. So for instance, the volatile organic compounds in Colorado, they show that the proximity to oil and gas facilities elevates cancer risk. And there's another one showing that at a nationwide scale, 18 million people live near oil and gas wells, many of which are marginalized. It's a recent article And then flaring is flaring is when you burn methane, because either you don't have the infrastructure to use the natural gas somewhere else, or it's not economically feasible to use it, and so you burn it. And the advantage of flaring, as opposed to just releasing the methane, is that flaring, when you burn methane, it turns into CO2, which has a smaller global warming potential, but it's still bad, right? Because there's a lot of flaring. So there's one article that shows that 3 basins in the US accounted for over 83% of all unconventional oil and gas flaring activity over an 8-year period. And shockingly, 500,000 people in these basins reside within 5 kilometers of a flare. And 39% of them live near more than 100 nightly flares. And BIPOC populations are disproportionately exposed to flaring. An article by Cushing. And there's another one showing that just a 1% increase in the amount of flared natural gas in North Dakota would increase the respiratory-related hospital visitation by 0.73%, and so on. So health impacts from refineries, from the proximity to refineries, bulk stations, terminals. 6 million people in the US live within 3 miles of a refinery. The health impacts from the oil and gas facilities on African American communities, an article by the Clean Air Task Force, very interesting. The share of toxic pollutants from petroleum bulk stations and terminals impacts 71% of minorities and 19% of low-income population, while the population average for these groups is it's 39%. In other words, 71% of minorities are affected, when the average in the country is 39%. In other words, many more people, many more disadvantaged communities are affected. And this is from, sorry?
Dr. Pinto deMoura, we're running out of time, so if you can summarize now, thank you.
Sure, I'm almost finished. So I was going to talk a little bit about the strategies to decrease air pollution, electrification, vehicle efficiency, clean liquid fuels, and equitable mobility, but I already talked about this last time. And fortunately, all of this is stuff is material I already talked about. So I can answer questions about these later. Our study on inequitable exposure to PM 2.5 and the public health benefits of eliminating tailpipe emissions. And we can also talk about policies a little bit later. Okay, well, get to the end here. Just before we move on, one more quick thing. I would like to let you know what the UCS Science Network is. And it's a community of scientists, that it's an inclusive community that embraces diversity. So take a look. I put the link here. We would love it if you joined the Science Network. All right, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this enlightening presentation. We do have a question, Dr. Stewart.
Yes, thank you for the excellent presentation. I wanted to know, there's a potentially looming United Auto Workers strike that I saw on the news this morning. And though we know that most of the time it has to do with contractual issues and compensation, I wanted to know if the widespread use and production and implementation of electric vehicles has anything to do with affects job security at all for auto workers. I was just curious. Though we know that there's tremendous benefits from a climate standpoint, does it impact that sector's job security given the recommended transition to electronic vehicles?
Okay, that's an excellent question. I can answer it generally, but I wanted to mention a study by the Economic Policy Institute that addresses exactly that. So this study from 2021 shows that employment in the US auto sector could rise by over 150,000 jobs in 2030. But we have to have smart policies, right? You know, for instance, we have to we have to have strong labor standards. We have to have training, right, for the transition at a community level. The auto assembly share in this country must rise, and various other things. So if we don't do this right, the cost of inaction, we could actually lose jobs. Right. So the whole point of this study is that it is possible to not, you know, to create jobs as opposed to lose jobs. And it is on a more telescopic view of the issue. It is this transition to a decarbonized economy is huge, right? It's something that you know, we haven't had this kind of transition for, you know, I don't think we've ever had such a quick transition to different technologies, and so it's extremely important to think about the training component, and you know, to look at how people around the country in different industries are going to continue to make a living. But there is money in the Inflation Reduction Act for a lot of these transitions, and so yeah, it's all now in whether and how well this money is implemented, how well it's used in the various implementations. But it is possible to do this without hurting people.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pinto deMoura. And I really know that this discussion can go on much longer, but we need to wrap up this session. So I'd like to thank you for your talk and thank all of you for participating in our webinar series. I hope that you found it useful. As a reminder, the webinars are the second Friday of each month. Our next is scheduled for October 13th on the topic of mental health. Before you leave, we ask you to take a moment to complete this survey if you haven't already. The link is in the chat. And as announced at the start of the webinar, we are pleased to offer CME credit for our webinars this year. To claim the CME credit, please follow the link in the chat or scan the QR code that is on the screen and follow the directions on our website. The activity code for today to claim your CME credit is 13062. This now concludes the session. Thank you very much for joining us and have a wonderful day. Thank you, Dr. Pinto deMoura.
You're welcome.